At the start of this story, everything looked simple. Brussels stepped up to the microphone and made a bold announcement. By 2027, Europe would completely cut itself off from Russian gas. No more pipelines, no more dependency, no more leverage from Moscow. This wasn't presented as just an energy decision. It was framed as a historic power move, Europe standing on its own feet after decades of reliance. After the war in Ukraine, EU leaders believed the moment had finally arrived. The crisis, they thought, had forced unity. Painful choices were unavoidable, and everyone understood that. In Brussels, the mood was confident, fast, decisive. This wasn't a debate anymore, it was a direction. To EU officials, this was Europe choosing sovereignty over vulnerability, like finally canceling a bad contract that had kept the lights on but left you exposed. Yes, it would hurt in the short term, higher prices, difficult adjustments, but in the long run, Europe would be stronger, safer, and independent. And for a brief moment, it looked like everyone agreed. Then the plan detonated. Almost immediately, the announcement triggered open rebellion inside the European Union itself. Not protests in the streets, something far more dangerous. Governments pushing back, publicly, and saying no. This wasn't Russia reacting. This wasn't outside pressure. This was Europe fighting Europe. What Brussels thought was a unifying decision turned into the biggest internal stress test the EU has faced since the war began. Countries that were supposed to fall in line instead dug in their heels. Allies became obstacles. Consensus collapsed. And suddenly, the conversation shifted from gas pipelines to something much deeper and more uncomfortable. Because once the dust settled, one question hung in the air, sharp, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. When it really matters, who actually runs Europe? Brussels, or the individual nations forced to live with the consequences? That question is where this story truly begins. To understand what happened next, you have to step away from Brussels conference rooms and into everyday life inside countries like Hungary and Slovakia. From Brussels, the gas ban is described in clean, abstract language energy transition, strategic autonomy, long-term resilience. On paper, it sounds reasonable, even necessary. But in Budapest, the same decision looks very different. For Hungary, Russian gas isn't a political symbol. It's what heats apartments in winter. It's what keeps factories running. It's what prevents energy bills from doubling overnight. Cut that supply too fast, and the impact isn't theoretical. It shows up on household bills, in job losses, and in factory shutdowns. Think of it like this. Brussels is talking about changing the engine of the car. Hungary is worried the car might stop in the middle of the highway. Hungary and Slovakia sit inland. They don't have direct access to the sea. They can't just build a port and start importing liquefied gas tomorrow. Their entire energy system was built around pipelines that already exist, pipelines coming from the east. Replacing that isn't like switching phone providers. It's like rebuilding the plumbing of a city while people are still living in it. This is where sovereignty enters the story. From Hungary's point of view, this wasn't the EU setting a shared goal. It felt like Brussels dictating how Hungarians should heat their homes and power their economy without fully carrying the consequences. That's why Hungary didn't treat the gas ban as climate policy or foreign policy. They treated it as a national survival issue, and that changes everything. When Prime Minister Viktor Orbán pushed back, it wasn't framed as rebellion for rebellion's sake. The message was simple. If this decision crashes our economy, we're the ones who pay the price, not Brussels. So Hungary's stance wasn't "we hate the EU." It was "we refuse to be overruled on something this fundamental." This wasn't anti-Europe. It was anti-being told to accept pain decided somewhere else. And once that line was crossed, Hungary didn't just complain. They prepared to fight, using the EU's own system. When a small country faces a giant system like the European Union, brute force is useless. Hungary knows it can't outvote the bloc. It can't threaten sanctions. And it certainly can't win a shouting match with Brussels. So it did something far more effective. It reached for the rule book. Instead of protesting in the streets or storming out of meetings, Hungary launched a legal counterattack. It's quiet, technical, and honestly, extremely dangerous for the EU's timeline. Here's the core of their argument, explained simply. Hungary says cutting off Russian gas isn't just a trade decision. It's not like changing tariffs on cheese or cars. Energy, they argue, is national security. When you remove a country's primary energy supply, you're affecting its ability to function as a state. And under EU law, major security decisions require unanimity. Every member gets a veto. That veto exists for moments exactly like this, when a country believes its survival is at risk. Hungary's accusation is blunt. Brussels knew this would never pass as a security vote, so it rebranded the decision as a trade issue to push it through faster, with fewer objections. In other words, Hungary claims the EU didn't change the goal. It changed the label to avoid resistance. So Hungary took the fight to the EU's top court. But here's the part most people miss. Winning the case is almost irrelevant. Courts move slowly. Appeals take years. And every month the case drags on, the 2027 deadline gets closer. The closer it gets, the harder it becomes to actually build the infrastructure needed to replace Russian gas. This lawsuit is a delay bomb. Hungary isn't trying to knock down the building. It's trying to lock the doors, jam the elevators, and slow construction until the entire plan becomes unrealistic. This is how small states fight giants in complex systems. They don't stop decisions. They stretch time until the decision collapses under its own weight. And while Brussels is stuck arguing over legal definitions, Hungary is doing something else. Something that makes this defiance far less risky. They're securing backup. Because if you're going to challenge the entire EU, you'd better not be standing alone. That's when a powerful player from outside Europe enters the story. This is where the story takes a sharp turn. Just as Hungary is locking the EU into legal gridlock, news quietly emerges of a meeting that changes the balance completely. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán sits down with US President Donald Trump. Not for photos, not for vague promises, but for something very specific. And what comes out of that meeting is a one-year exemption from US sanctions on Russian energy. At first that might sound technical. Boring even. But it's not. This is a golden ticket. Here's why it matters. While Brussels is trying to seal Europe off from Russian gas, the United States, Europe's closest ally, just handed Hungary a legal doorway to keep buying it. That means Hungary now has protection from American penalties at the exact moment the EU is trying to apply pressure. This isn't symbolic support. It's practical leverage. Energy sanctions are like financial landmines. One wrong step, and banks won't touch you. Insurance disappears. Deals collapse. The US waiver removes those landmines for Hungary, at least temporarily. It gives them breathing room. It gives them confidence. And most importantly, it changes the risk calculation. Before this, Hungary's defiance could have been dismissed as a bluff. A small country daring the EU, hoping Brussels backs down first. But with Washington in the background, it's no longer a bluff. It's a calculated move with a safety net. Zoom out, and the implications are even bigger. This creates a visible crack in Western unity. On one side, Brussels is pushing hard for collective discipline. On the other, Washington is quietly enabling a member state to step outside that discipline. No speeches. No press conferences, just action. The message this sends is chilling. Hungary is not isolated. It has a powerful friend willing to undercut EU pressure when it suits American interests. And once Brussels realizes that persuasion has failed, legal pressure is stalling, and outside backing is in play, the EU starts thinking about something far more extreme. Not convincing the rebels, but changing the rules, so rebellion becomes impossible. At this point, Brussels faces a nightmare scenario. Persuasion didn't work. Legal pressure is stuck in court. and one of its own members now has outside backing. So EU leaders start discussing something that, until now, was almost unthinkable. To understand how serious this is, you need to understand unanimity. Right now, for the EU to impose serious sanctions or make major security decisions, every single member state must agree. One no vote is enough to stop everything. This rule exists for a reason. It protects smaller countries from being steamrolled by larger ones. It's the safety lock on the system. But that safety lock is now being used as a weapon. Hungary, and potentially others, can block action not because they're powerless, but because the system gives them that right. And from Brussels' perspective, this is becoming unmanageable. So the idea on the table is radical, remove unanimity for sanctions, and replace it with majority voting. In simple terms, this would mean the EU could punish or pressure a member state even if that country strongly objects, as long as enough others agree. This is the nuclear option. Why? Because it fundamentally changes what the EU is. The European Union was built as a club of equals, where membership meant shared rules but also guaranteed protection from domination. Majority voting on economic issues already exists, but extending it to sanctions and security crosses a red line. It turns the EU from a consensus-based union into something closer to a centralized authority. And that creates an impossible dilemma. If Brussels forces unity by overriding dissent, it may keep the system moving, but at the cost of trust. Small and medium-sized states will start asking a dangerous question. If our veto can be taken away, what protection do we really have? But if Brussels doesn't act, the EU risks paralysis, unable to respond decisively to external threats or internal sabotage. This isn't just a policy argument anymore. It's an identity crisis. The EU is being pushed to choose between functionality and legitimacy. And while leaders debate this in Brussels, something irreversible is already happening on the ground. Power inside Europe is shifting, away from the old center. For decades, European politics ran on a simple, unwritten rule. If France and Germany agreed, the rest of the European Union usually followed. This partnership was the engine of Europe, the stabilizer, the deal-maker, the quiet authority behind most major decisions. That engine is now stalling. The gas crisis exposed something new. Compliance is no longer automatic. Countries in Central Europe, led by Hungary and Slovakia, are no longer acting alone or quietly complaining behind closed doors. They're coordinating, they're comparing notes, and they're using the tools the EU gives them, especially veto power, as leverage. Instead of asking, "What do Paris and Berlin want?" they're asking, "What do we get in return?" This is a major shift. Veto power was once seen as an emergency brake, something you only pull in extreme situations. Now it's becoming a bargaining chip, a way to demand concessions, delays, or exemptions before agreeing to anything. Think of the EU less like a marching army and more like a crowded intersection with no traffic lights. Everyone is negotiating who moves next. This doesn't mean the EU is collapsing tomorrow, but it does mean it's becoming slower, messier, and far less predictable. And that matters beyond Europe. When the EU can't act decisively, its influence weakens. Partners don't know what Europe can deliver. Rivals start testing limits. Markets price in uncertainty. The shift away from a clear leadership center changes how the world interacts with Europe. Not as a single voice, but as a collection of competing priorities. And just as political power is fragmenting, the hard reality of energy is catching up. Because all of this debate rests on one big assumption, that Europe can actually replace Russian gas fast enough. And that assumption is about to run into reality. On paper, the 2027 deadline sounds firm, confident, final. In reality, many energy experts look at it and shake their heads. Replacing Russian gas isn't like changing suppliers on a contract. It's more like redesigning the entire electrical system of a continent while it's still running. Start with the basics. Much of Europe's gas infrastructure was built over decades to move fuel from east to west through fixed pipelines. Liquefied natural gas, the alternative, works differently. It arrives by ship, needs massive coastal terminals, special storage facilities, and then new pipelines to move it inland. That means new ports, new pipelines, and new grids. Each of these projects costs billions. Each one takes years, and many face environmental reviews, legal challenges, and local opposition. You don't build thousands of kilometers of pipeline on a political schedule. For countries like Hungary and Slovakia, the problem is even worse. They're landlocked. They depend on infrastructure that doesn't exist yet, infrastructure controlled by other countries. If those projects are delayed or over budget, they're the ones left exposed. Now add the economic reality. Gas prices don't rise evenly. Wealthier countries can absorb higher costs. Poorer or more industrial-dependent economies can't. A factory in Budapest doesn't get cheaper energy just because Brussels says the transition is necessary. This is why Hungary and Slovakia keep saying the same thing. This isn't resistance. It's arithmetic. They're asking who pays for the transition, who absorbs the shock, and who gets protected if the system breaks. So far, those answers are vague. And when deadlines are ambitious but plans are incomplete, tension is guaranteed. This is the fuel feeding the political fire. Not ideology, but math, timelines, and money. And as Europe struggles to replace Russian gas, it doesn't disappear from the global market. It simply flows elsewhere, creating new winners, new power brokers, and new global consequences. Once Europe decided to cut itself off from Russian gas, the shock didn't stay inside Europe. It rippled outward, fast. Suddenly, the EU was on a global shopping spree. Desperate to secure energy, European governments rushed to sign long-term gas deals with countries like Qatar, Azerbaijan, and Algeria. These weren't normal business negotiations. When you're in a hurry and short on options, you don't just pay more, you give up leverage. Energy exporters noticed immediately. Countries that were once just suppliers became geopolitical power players overnight. They gained influence, bargaining power, and political weight, not through war, but through scarcity. At the same time, Europe's massive demand pushed up global gas prices. That didn't just hit European consumers. It affected factories in Asia, power plants in Latin America, and developing economies that suddenly found themselves priced out of energy markets. Now add finance to the picture. As soon as the EU's internal conflict went public, investors started pricing in something new: EU instability. When systems look unpredictable, money gets nervous. Capital flows toward places that seem stable, neutral, and insulated from political shocks. Not because those regions caused the crisis, but because stability becomes valuable when others are fighting themselves. And that's the deeper takeaway. This story was never just about gas. It exposed fractures inside the Western alliance. It showed how quickly unity can crack under pressure, and it accelerated a trend already underway: the shift toward a world with multiple power centers, flexible alliances, and constant negotiation. Global influence is no longer owned by the loudest or the largest. It flows to those who can stay stable while others fragment. So the real question isn't whether Europe can survive this energy fight. It's whether the future of global politics will be shaped by cooperation built on trust, or by alliances held together by pressure, deadlines, and fear. If you want deeper, no-nonsense breakdowns of how power actually works behind the headlines, subscribe, share your thoughts below, and join the conversation.